It's like the...
I don't know. Did you get enough cheesecake before you came in?
Oh, that was delicious. Thank you.
Oh, good,
and the rest of the conclave, we were just having a good old time.
Great coffee back there.
Oh, yeah.
Love it.
I'm sorry the espresso is so strong, but these guys are like, I don't know, what were they in a war in Italy or something?
Imported it from Spain.
Okay, that's all well and good. I want to talk to you about the court system. I don't know how to tell you this, but it's not fair. It's very corrupt. And I hear you're writing a big article on it.
Yes. Can you tell us more?
I'm writing that article for Michael McCabe because when I once said to him something that sounded like a conspiracy, he looked at me with that look on his face like, oh, well, I will look forward to seeing the evidence on that, Douglas. So I started working on this, and it was like 150 pages long because there was so much corruption in the court when you look at it. Think of this. You can be appointed to a court without any prerequisites. You don't have to have a high school diploma. You don't have to have a law degree. You don't have to know what the inside of a court looks like, and you can be appointed. And once you're appointed, it's for life in some cases. And if it's a federal appointment, then you're somehow higher than state courts. You're higher than city courts. You're higher than municipalities because someone appointed you to this position. And what's really amazing is Supreme Court justices may not have ever litigated a single court case in their life. They may have only been an assistant. So we started looking into where this comes from. And unfortunately, as well as the other things we've been researching lately, it goes back to the 1 square mile of the city of London, UK, and the Crown Bar Association. And every bar association in America looks exactly like bar associations in Britain. As a matter of fact, they take similar oaths, they follow the similar rules, and strangely enough, the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the first one, it was replaced, said no lawyers. Why did they say no lawyers? Because when you become a lawyer, you are appointed as a landed gentry and you become an esquire. You become literally royalty. You, in other words, become part of the crown.
Now this sounds like conspiracy theory stuff.
I know, but once you see the article, you'll see that it's true.
I know you don't write conspiracy theory. I'm just saying I've heard this around the internet before, but I could never get my teeth into it.
For instance, why are there federal courts? I'll ask Michael McCabe, who knows more about suffering in courts than practically anyone I know, so his experience comes from the lashes upon his back. Why are there federal appellate courts and federal circuit courts when they're not even supposed to be in states? And why do they usurp the authority of the states when they should only have powers and not rights? And why do they always have a preference for corporations instead of human beings?
Well, I haven't studied this deeply, but as I understand it, the original idea was there would be no federal courts. But what happened as states started having interstate issues arise, they started needing another forum besides that in each of the states. So these federal courts started out on a limited basis, as I understand it, and now have grown into the monster they've become.
And I've asked you this before, and I've asked people, and they look at me with a look like I'm just completely insane. If we hadn't given and invented and given federal powers to Washington, D.C. to exact upon us the Internal Revenue Service and the Social Security system and the debt of the Federal Reserve, and then having to license our children at birth and having to license ourselves to drive on the road and tax us 4 times on it, if we didn't have to have any of those federal services, which we do not, those are state services that can be provided, what would the federal government do? What they're supposed to do?
Maybe keep illegal aliens out of the country?
That is what they're supposed to do.
Defend
Protect this country. The entire federal system works underneath who? The commander-in-chief. That is the reason that the head law enforcement people are called generals, like the attorney general or deputy attorney generals. These are generals. They're in a military system. And George Washington set that up when he incorporated the Washington, D.C., which is outside of the bounds of the states' rights and the Constitution of the United States of America, not the the United States Incorporated, which is what Washington, D.C. is. So if you take federalism out of the picture, the 4.5 million federal employees would come down to 1.5 million military federal employees who work under the commander-in-chief. The rest don't need to be there unless they are prosecuting what? Federal regulations and laws, and as you always point out, these regulations are not laws, and enforcing things that don't need to be enforced unless the federal overreach goes into places it shouldn't be going.
Well, it just stands to reason that federal courts are there for the benefit of large corporations, because the average small business, the average individual, can't afford to take a case to federal court and then an appeals a circuit court and then potentially to the Supreme Court. What we need to get back to is where we can walk down to our courts and get justice on a local basis and maybe at a state basis, but where we're actually looking at these people face to face rather than these ethereal judges sitting off in some high mountain waiting to dispense justice to us. I mean, that's ridiculous what we have now.
Certain circuit courts are noted for being so partisan that before an issue arises, you know if it's going to that court what the outcome will be. Not only that, if you hear something on the news of someone challenging the president's right to do something that the previous president did and no one challenged those rights, and you look at the idiot judge that did that, we can probably predict what court it came out of. Now, if they are that partisan, if they are that one-sided, why would anyone allow them to stay on in the job of passing out justice? They are biased from the beginning. Why would we have Supreme Court justices that we know which side they lean before they are appointed? That should disqualify them if you can know that they're either left or right or wherever they are. That is politics in supposedly a court system where Lady Justice has a blindfold as she's weighing things, and once it's weighed, she uses a sword to lop off the head of the guilty. Well, I don't see the head of the guilty being lopped off of people who are in these court systems that are in fact passing out and meeting what they call justice in their courts.
Well, I think that the one thing we need to add to this mix are the law schools that these people come from. And if we actually look at the major courts in our country, it is very few law schools that actually are used to select the justices and the judges we have. And in the Supreme Court, I think that there are like 6, 7 from Harvard, a couple from Yale, and maybe one other. So how does Harvard get the franchise for the Supreme Court? Where'd that come from? That's ridiculous. And I think there's only one Protestant in the whole mix. So what's going on with the selection of our justices? And why do they keep coming from the same law schools?
Because it's all slanted. It's all one-sided. We're the only 2 nations in the world that use grand jury indictments. And as you always say, you can indict a ham sandwich in a grand jury indictment. Is that the phrase you always use?
Right.
And I think that's absurd. It's a star chamber to prosecute those that you want prosecuted who are not part of the elite. And it's there to protect the elite.
Well, now, what about the special counsel, for example? That seems like, where is that in the Constitution, and how did that arise, and how is that associated with this corrupt federal system? Pause.
It's an SES regulation, remember, that was a law previously, and then it was changed into a regulation. And when it was changed into a regulation, it was Janet Reno who broadened the scope of it and then allowed it to be basically an endless budget.
It was 1978, at the same
Yes.
time as the SES was created.
Yes.
The Office of Special Counsel was created.
Correct.
Right, so it's like this extrajudicial thing that's been layered on top of our government that is not serving us. I mean, Mueller's still in there spinning around when there is no Russian collusion. What is he doing in there?
Here's the deal. If you need a special investigator because the Department of Justice and or the FBI, then they're all fired.
Yeah.
They're all fired.
You got 500 attorneys over there.
It's 150,000 people. you're all fired, because if you are compromised and there's nobody in there that can do your job, then get the heck out, because you're being paid a fortune by U.S. taxpayers to do nothing but cover the trail of the corrupt. That's what Mueller's investigation is.
What kind of scheme is that? You appoint an attorney general. The attorney general's got a conflict with the president, so you've got to bring in a special counsel to fight with one of his employees. It makes no sense. The special counsel is there as, in paraphrasing Chris Farrell from Judicial Watch, is put in place so that justice can go there to die.
Correct, but I even see it at another level, that Mueller has positioned himself to take over the government, and he is directly opposing Trump, the duly elected president.
Right.
We have right there in Washington a battle for who is going to be the commander-in-chief.
Well, yeah, and it's even worse because his authority doesn't come from a law anymore.
No.
That expired. It comes from an internal policy decision made by Janet Reno in 1999 that created an Office of Special Counsel within the Justice Department. And that's the authority that he's using to go against the president. I mean,
right,
there's
but he's fully supported by the senior executive service.
Right.
So that is their army. So Obama's army is what we call the SES. They're entrenched. You've got Mueller as their head of this army. He's positioned himself to oppose Donald Trump.
Right.
And so he's not giving up. And Trump isn't going to fire him. So you've got a stalemate here until we can push it.
And now we have the Democratic Party and the Rhino Republicans trying to push through a bill that would protect Mueller from getting fired by the president.
Because they're concerned about their leader leaving.
I mean, think about that. That is a rogue government at
Yes.
that point. If you can't fire one of your officials that presumably works for you
Correct.
and is not there by the authority of law, then we are
Right.
truly in a lawless state with what Congress is trying to do right now.
This is what the domestic enemy looks like. They have infiltrated our government through these organizations, and they are directly opposing the will of the people.
Right.
The small group, the counterintelligence group that was looking after George Papadopoulos, and then later the group of Carter Page, both of those counterintelligence operations merged and became the small group, and they called themselves the group to impeach once the president had been elected. And that group became the Mueller investigation. Same people. And then they added people from Wilmer Hale and others, the lawyers, the 17 lawyers that came to work with Mueller. They all are now SES employees, and he gets to spend $100 million a year on this investigation without asking anyone's permission. That's the rules that Janet Reno set up for a special investigator, which it's an oxymoron in itself. If you have to have a special investigator, it cannot then be supervised by someone in the department that you know has to be compromised, or you wouldn't need a special investigator.
Right.
Plus the new thing, it's compromised because of all the leaks. It's compromised because of Judge Contreras was on the FISA court. He's a friend of Strzok. Strzok and Page memos show a conspiracy beyond a conspiracy. It shows actually the facts of the leaking. It shows all these things. And now, what do we get? Oh, the newest thing. 40 questions that Mueller would be asking the president. I don't believe them, but let's just take, for example, the general thought, what they are implying. About over half of them are detailed questions about Comey and Comey's conversations, which we now have as many as 3 different versions of these conversations in his book, in his public appearance on the media, and then in his testimony. And what are we supposed to believe? Mr. Trump, make sure you don't have to answer any of those. You have executive
those are
privilege.
all a setup.
It's a lawyer trick. This is what happens in a grand jury. That's why you say you can indict a ham sandwich, because
Right.
you're guilty before you go there. They're just looking for any reason to hang it on. That's what happened with Michael Flynn. That's what happened with Gates, with Rick Gates. That's what happened with Paul Manafort.
What is Mueller going to do? Trump says, forget it. I'm not answering these questions. Go fly a kite. What is Mueller going to do? What, get out his army and come and oppose the president?
We were laughing earlier because all of those questions imply, first off, it doesn't imply, it proves, if those are true, and I don't believe they are true, but if they are true, it confirms what we said from the beginning. There was collusion from the beginning, and Comey was given immunity from the beginning because he has he must have given testimony to Mueller, which is then going to be used against Trump to try to trip him up because of the following. Mueller and Comey, because they're lawyers, came up with the new rule that anybody in a top position in the FBI or the DOJ that writes down field notes, 302 notes, after a meeting, those are true. No matter what anybody else says, no matter who was in the room, if they make a note, that's the reason Susan Rice made her note. That's the reason Donna Brazile created her exoneration. That's the reason Jonathan Weiner did his.
Is this like the Pope speaking ex cathedra?
Yes.
It sounds like a cockamamie rule. It's not tested. Just because a guy writes it down doesn't mean it's true.
All the great criminals learned their technique from the Jesuits.
Yeah.
Well, the Pope is infallible, and so are lawyers.
Only when he speaks ex cathedra, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's not always.
Well, that's when the Curia is backing him up.
Right.
And otherwise, but see, we don't want to get into the Pope today because...
No, but I'm just asking, why...
The Pope did something today that was so beautiful...
He doesn't want to get into it
that
today.
It confirms what I had already said we had said in so many articles and so many things. The Pope completely took control of the Knights of Malta.
Today.
Well,
he had already kicked out the head of the Knights of Malta.
That,
we had already predicted this was going to happen. People laughed at us. They said, not possible. It's more than possible. It happened.
Okay, but explain how the Knights of Malta are related to the Queen.
Okay, first off, we're talking about courts. Where do courts come from?
We took a right turn.
No.
He's going to take a
right turn. Right back.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
I know the weeds. I jump up real high and I can see where I'm headed back. The canon law, right? And who controlled canon law? That was the Pope. He was infallible when his curia, his ecclesiastical college, supported his decisions, as you just pointed out. So when the Pope spoke with the support of the curia, he was infallible. Well, that is the basis of canon law. Well, it sure is nice when you have a law system based upon the infallibility of the group of elites at the top. Well, that's the same thing that got turned into British law and what is called Temple law. Now, Temple bar.
Can I interrupt you a minute?
Yes.
I will point out that the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, never bought that concept.
Because
this day.
Because they didn't have warriors. They didn't have armies. They didn't have a Pope who led armies and led banks and had led crusades and led wars on the basis of supposedly divine right of the Pope and his ecclesiastical powers, and his infallibility. Complete nonsense. But when you have a canon law system, and that's the first law, then you are the primary law. And until there's something that can overrule that. So at one point we were talking today about the Pope just said, yep, I own the world and I'm going to give out charters and I'm going to give out permissions to countries to go and to settle those lands in my name. And he created the first contracts, the first charters, the first corporations. And some of those corporations, well, first off, the corporations came a little later, but he created charters. And then those countries created charters, and that's how America came to be, and that's why we still live underneath the charters that were written for the Virginia colony, for Williamsburg, for all of them, for Penn, for all of them. They're all charters, and they're all from monarchies, right? Mm. And so this goes back to the Vatican and the Vatican canon law. Then became, because of British East India Company and Dutch East India Company, they had to have merchant law, because these guys were out on the seas killing each other over the trade wars and the spices and the resource theft and the wars they were carrying on. And then there had to be merchant laws, and then they went to the sword. Then it had to be admiralty laws, and it had to be basically whose territory are you in and who gave you the power to be a judge in that territory.
And a lot of the people that work in the swamp, they're just pirates in suits.
And you were just appointed. Betsy, I now make you the head judge of all of India. Why? Because you're in my corporation, the British East India Company, and now you're a judge. Because why? Because I'm in the bar,
right. And
I took an oath to who? Who do you take an oath to? Who's the bar? Temple Bar is the Templars. That is the Templar Knights, or the Knights Templar of the Pope, who were there. They were the bankers, and they were the warriors who kept the roads to Rome all the way from Europe to Jerusalem open, and they were banks along the way. So they were the bankers, okay? So they had a group in the city of London, and they actually owned it when it was called Londinium. And so the Templars have owned the banking there from the beginning, but because they were Catholics, they couldn't have usury, so they had to use Jews. So they had Jewish court bankers throughout all of Europe, and throughout, especially in in Venice, where the doges and the rulers of the city-states of Italy, particularly Venice, would be the bankers for the Crusades, for the wars, for all wars. They were also building the ships that moved the troops and so on and so forth.
So
they controlled war.
How does that loop back to courts?
That's because the Templars were connected to the Hospitallers, who then became the Knights of Malta. And the Knights of Malta were giving they were giving succor, they were giving help, and they created hospitals, but they also created cities and walled cities, and they became really what you could say is the merchant groups of bankers who took over for the Templars because they were overthrown at a certain point. But it all started with the Templars moving from Vatican and from Venice, and then they moved into Switzerland, and they moved into Hamburg, and then they moved into Holland, into Amsterdam, and then they finally moved into London, and then they moved into, of course, back into Switzerland, and they control the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which is in D.C. So when they say that the Vatican City, London, the City of London, UK, and Washington, D.C. control the law, the money, and the war, that's and the religion, because law is all about religion, isn't it? What is religion? Telling you when you've broken the law. So when Vatican canon law turned into merchant law, turned into admiralty law, turned into British bar law, we still have bar associations in America that take those oaths, and when you do, you become an esquire, you become a landed gentry. The same old nonsense that you're above the common people, because they wouldn't let the commoners have land. Only the gentry, only the royalty could have land. So when you became a lawyer in the old days in the colonies, you were swearing an oath to the people who wrote the charters, one monarchy or the other, and usually, quite frequently, of course, it was the British Crown. Or you were in fact also swearing allegiance to the Pope, whether you knew it or not, because of the charter and the tenets of the charter, especially if you got into a war and you got a war debt, and then the people, the commoners, were given war debt and not land, and that's why you have tax on land. And still to this day, you can't own land in America because the Queen is still taxing you, the tax put on fiat currency from the Federal Reserve. So I know it sounds very circuitous.
Use the IRS to come shake you down for the money.
The IRS is illegal.
They have it's like a global mafia.
It
and
is.
Hillary Clinton would have fit right in because she comes from a Chicago mafia family. So she was going to be the Queen Don.
The central bank in London loaned out the fiat currency and backed it supposedly with hard silver and gold. And they knew it couldn't be paid back. They knew there'd be inflation as the currency left the country. So they knew it could never be paid back. It was odious debt. It's what all central banks do, and that's what our U.S. Federal Reserve does, and the central banks look into it. Those are Brits who created it and who own it. Do not be fooled by the nonsense they tell you about the U.S. Federal Reserve. So, to go back to your point, Michael, I know it sounds like a conspiracy, but this goes back all the way to Vatican law. And it's still in our system now. We are still under the auspices of the Roman legal system, which is the leftover of which then became the Vatican legal system. So we are still literally living in the shadow of Roman law. And if you are not a lawyer, unfortunately in America, you don't even know the laws that you could be prosecuted for or that you need to defend yourself against very expensive lawyers who will ruin your life because you're not an esquire.
Okay, you brought us up to our current system. And I've been fighting in our current system that I believed had a equal scale on it for all people who became litigants within the bar. Now, what I have come to believe is that, like you said, that the case is determined before you ever come to court. and that one way or another, between the lawyers involved and the judge involved and the federal employees, the judicial employees involved, one way or another, they're going to make sure that you lose if they want you to lose. And when you start looking at their investments, and that is one telltale sign that they can't totally hide, but they've done a pretty good job of hiding it because they've hidden all their investments in large corporations inside mutual funds. But what's now popping out is these mutual funds themselves are becoming the culprits. And, for example, BlackRock. There are a lot of judges that hold BlackRock investments. And didn't you tell me the other day that, what was it, the size of BlackRock? It's the largest
corporation in the world. They call it the largest bank in the world. And there are so many BlackRocks, you can't name them all. And they manage $9.5 trillion, I think it is.
Huge holdings in real estate.
Largest.
Right.
In the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you look between our politicians and our judges, you will be surprised at the number of BlackRock holdings that exist. So when we start looking at this system, we're looking at a truly rigged system that is going to reward these corporations. And as you're saying, they receive their reason for being from a system that emerged out of the UK or the Great Britain based on this bar idea. And that's the one thing I've seen about attorneys. When you go to an attorney, their first objective is billable hours. It's not about your case. Secondly, it's about keeping the judge happy. That's not about your case. Thirdly, it's about making sure they're buds with all the judicial employees, because there are a zillion ways to Sunday to kill you with the rules of civil procedure, which largely clerks of courts handle. So you've got all these mechanisms built within the system to steer a case however you want. So the one thing I've come to describe the judicial system as is it's just one large legal sandbox. They want you in their sandbox. They love it when laymen respond when they've experienced injustice that I'm going to sue you. They love that because they're going to win. One side or the other is going to win. And the bottom line is the lawyers involved are all going to win because they're all going to get their billable hours, whether they're on the good guy's side or the bad guy's side. So they don't really care in the end.
Sounds like the banker wars. They
And,
get paid.
and their buds in the banking system have given the judges inside information about investments, and so these judges magically they become judges, and their net worth skyrockets over the years. And the same thing with politicians. And then you see the litigants that come before them, and sometimes you might see some semblance of fair treatment if it's two of the large corporations fighting with each other. That's probably when you might get decent opinions. But the rest of the time, they're going to use opinions as a big club over the person who's coming to the courts, probably thinking they're going to get justice. So I've come to the conclusion that one of the problems is that an inbuilt conflict of interest in having politicians who are lawyers. Because if you've got a situation where the persons writing the laws, the politicians, are also the people that are arguing the law and defending the law, then you have a situation that's ripe for corruption, because the politician is going to write a law, and then when they're out of politics, they're going to go consult on that law that they wrote because they know all the weaknesses in that law. And that's what we've seen, is that in this level of immorality, you can't write a law well enough to cover all the possibilities down the road. And each of these politicians know that. And something like almost a half of the politicians in the United States
and their
are
laws
lawyers.
are usually sitting on the shelf that have already been written by these George Soros type organizations, and they give it to the good senator to pass through.
Right.
And so the senator doesn't even know what's in it. He's just getting paid under the table or
I mean,
however
it's
they
just,
get paid.
it's just unreal that you could hear, though, there's a 1,200 page or 2,200 page bill that they haven't even read, and they voted
and nobody
on it.
should read it. Don't read it. It
Right.
was in the basement. Oh, really? We need to have government with full transparency. I'm tired of this. If the people cannot read a bill that's being passed, and we need time.
Yeah, I mean, they're just totally out of hand. The language is so confusing. I don't even think the politicians understand what it means most of the time. And it's convoluted. It's got cross-references to in page 3 to page 2,342, and then that's got 3 exceptions that refer back to page 549 and page 773. And the bottom line is nobody's going to look at those. Nobody's going to follow those. And so the laws themselves are a tool of creating this confusion that only those who have mastered and play in the system will ever win from.
Part of the article that we're presenting is about the 13th Amendment, which was to say no lawyers can be part of the federal government. Why would you want a lawyer, just as you pointed out, to build loopholes into laws which then they could be protected by client-attorney privilege, have insider information, make money off of it both ways, and they could even serve people on both sides of it, and they're still protected, which we see all the time now in Washington, D.C., that lawyers represent both sides of the story. So they initially said, no lawyers. We don't want any lawyers whatsoever in the Congress, because why? They knew that those lawyers would probably at that point be loyalists to the crown, and they would be continuing on the same type of landed gentry, where higher than you aristocracy, oligarchy based upon lawyers. And we don't want that. And it's very simple. To begin with, we forget that the Constitution allows the Congress to create federal court and the court system as it is. So to begin with, it was a race to see which colony, which state later, could establish these federal courts in the state to handle issues between different states. And the faster you could appoint them and the faster you could appoint your friends into them, the more you could control commerce if it was based upon federal commerce. So it's very simple. All we need to do is the following. All federal and circuit and appellate courts in states no longer exist. They were never duly founded. They were only supposed to be in territories, not in states. States have powers. Those powers cannot be usurped by federal courts. Secondly, all judges everywhere must be elected. And if you don't do a good job, then the people that you're serving should notice that and notice that you think it's your court instead of their court. And any judge, in my opinion, in my very silly and capricious remark here, any judge that calls it their court should immediately no longer be a judge. It's not their court. It's the court of the people. And if it's their court, then it's exactly what they're calling it.
That's a very monarchical view of their domain.
Exactly. Their sovereignty. And
Right.
it shows exactly what they're about. So I think it's very easy to fix the system. And I think that we could get justice back into the court system, but we would have to leave the shadow of Roman legalism, move out of the shadow of papal elite dominant control, star chamber type of protection of the people at the top and the commoners get the rest, and get away from the bar system that we have right now that is still aligned with the Temple Bar in the City of London. And I think we need to understand that the justice system itself, if it is partisan, that in itself demonstrates that it is biased, ineffectual, it is compromised, and should be, that person should simply not be there. If they can't make decisions based upon unbiased justice, why do we call them a Supreme Court justice?
How can it be unbiased if the person who's judge is an attorney whose profession is similar to the two people that are arguing before him or her on both sides of the argument. And when we know that there is a network that exists outside of our normal legal system that only they can play in. So it seems to me that we really got to consider, now this may sound radical, but I think that we ought to make engineers judges and only allow engineers to be judges.
Because they're mathematicians, and if they don't see the evidence, they're not going there.
And
they're
if it
going to
doesn't
calculate
make sense,
it.
exactly.
They're going to be like Solomon. Okay, cut the baby in half.
Yeah, or something like that. But the idea is that engineers are not there. They don't see their job as perpetuating their profession for the rest of their life in one project. So in other words, you don't build a building forever. You build it and you move on to another one. So there's this idea of beginning, middle, and end. And at the end, you make a good decision. You hopefully build a good building, and you're accountable for it. And if you didn't do a good job, people are going to notice pretty quickly.
Well, that sounds like a kind of judge that Trump would understand.
Exactly. And I literally mean this. I think that we've got to get away from people who see their profession as an end in itself rather than a means to an end, which is justice. And I think engineers inherently understand that about projects. And the other thing is they're much less emotional about the whole project, the process. And so they're going to be more focused on following the rules of civil procedure than attorneys are, who spend all their time figuring out how to beat the rules of civil procedure.
And I noticed that Trump has now, though they said he was doing a bad job, has more attorneys' appointments than any president in the same amount of time. And so I'm somewhat happy that we're getting more of a balanced system out there, but I think we got to adjust the whole system, and we have to take a whole complete revamping of it if we're going to see true justice come back into the justice system.